Scout of the Endless Frontier, Episode 12. The Sharp Edge of Trust. By Elton Garr. Standing in front of Leslie Horne's office, Elias was struck by the contradictions. President Horne was the head of the Lifton City Council, and arguably the second most powerful person on Lifton. Certainly the second most powerful in the government, with only the mayor outranking her. Yet the office she worked out of was far less impressive than the crime lord Ronan Vex's office. What made this even stranger was that Elias felt more danger here than talking to Ronan Vex. Vex had done everything he could to intimidate and manipulate Elias, but that had been blunt and clear. The type of thing Elias understood. But from what he had learned about President Horne, she broke Lifton's laws just as wantonly as Ronan, but without his code of honor. He took inspiration from Vex and decided to focus on the social intimidation, so pushed both of the double doors open wide and walked into her office, making a grand entrance. The secretary at her desk looked at Ronan over the rim of her glasses and said,
"Do you have an appointment?"
The room had a wooden bench, and a young woman sitting behind a desk with a huge book in front of her. President Horne, of course, wasn't in this room. She was in her private office, behind the secretary.
"I'm Elias Cade. I have an appointment."
The woman flipped the book's page and said,
"Have a seat. I'll call you when it is time."
It was time. But that was the way of civilized worlds. Everyone was late, so other people had to wait for them, making them late, so others had to wait for them. He had believed until recently that the soul of Lifton was different than the Commonwealth, that it could avoid the worst parts of human civilization. But just like people, places were changed by those around them. And Lifton was still part of the Commonwealth. A few minutes later, the secretary called for Elijah, and then Elisha. Elias decided that probably meant him since he was the only one here, and he walked up and said,
"Did you mean Elias Cade?"
The woman adjusted her glasses, looked down and said,
"It says Elijah."
"Fine. I'm Elijah Cade then."
She smiled, adjusted her glasses and said,
"Well, don't keep Mrs. Horne waiting. She's a busy woman."
Having been socially outmaneuvered by the secretary, Elias stormed past the woman. President Horne was dressed in Commonwealth fashion. Not the most recent, of course, but impressive for the frontier. It was a modular clothing design that allowed the same base layer of clothing to become whatever you needed. The version she wore had several formal attachments, which made it entirely impractical for anyone who needed to do genuine work. That was the point. Wearing something impractical demonstrated that you didn't have to work. The woman turned to look at Elias. Her face was thin and sharp, and her eyes pierced into him. This wasn't a woman who had gotten her position because of any innate charm, but by the power of her personality. Once the door was shut, she said,
"You can safely assume that there are no listening or security devices here."
"Because they would be highly illegal on Lifton,"
Elias said, probing to see if she would admit to employing the bounty hunter who had tried to capture him for the corporations.
"I am glad you understand. Why are you here?"
The woman put her hands behind her back as she walked around the room, making it impossible for Elias to know where to stand or sit.
"There is a threat to the Commonwealth. I just need to make sure people know."
"There is always a threat to the Commonwealth,"
President Horne said.
"This is of a different scale. But that hardly matters. I sent a message out on the pulse. In 3 days it will decrypt itself."
"And if you truly believed that people would act on that, you'd have flown back out to your wilds again."
"I've never understood humans as a group,"
Elias said.
"People will use this for their own agendas as always. Which is why I need to deal with something important before they get the chance. But the person I used to deal with this sort of thing had his hand shot off,"
Leslie said, glancing at the plasma gun on Elias's belt.
You have others.
And if he had been killed, I'd use one. That makes the legend stronger. But he spent several days in the hospital. That already hurt the mystique, and having someone show up before he could reasonably heal will damage it more.
I don't work for the corporations.
Elias said. The woman smiled and said,
You misunderstand. I'm the person on the council most opposed to letting the corporations in. I only work for the good of Lifton.
It took Elias a second to understand the brilliant tactic. The longer she spent fighting against the corporations, the more impactful it would be when she finally gave in and admitted that they needed them.
Tell me what you want.
I've heard rumors of a doctor who is giving black market implants, communication devices, computers, and other things that are illegal on Lifton.
I can't begin to imagine how you found out about that.
Elias said, trying to stay ahead in this conversation and failing. He had always been better at shooting things. Today he felt sure he was being set up, but had no idea how.
Your word that you'll do everything in your power to make sure everyone on Lifton knows about the dangers of the Nexari.
Elias said.
I will prepare Lifton for the future to the best of my ability.
Horn said. Elias left on her errand to get rid of the doctor who had probably been exposed because of Elias. But she wasn't entirely wrong either. Losing confidence in one of their leaders at the same time they learned about the Nexari would make things worse. Elias had only explored the wealthiest parts of Lifton. He pretended it was because that was where Vex's offices had been, and when you walked everywhere, it made sense to stay near things. But he had to admit that the expensive cafes and plush hotels had been nice. This part of the city was like a different world. It was built in and around the first stone quarry. A huge section of stone steps. Each of them was deep enough for a row of small homes, and tall enough for a single-story roof to be at the same height as the previous step. Those homes were made from whatever material had been available, and over the 100 years since they had been made, pieces had been replaced, creating mismatched buildings of wood, metal, plastic, and stone. There were also far more people here. The narrow stone roads were crowded. One group of children ran past him, throwing chunks of red rock the size of their fists at each other and laughing. There were other people sitting on porches, and a few people trying to push carts through the crowds and yelling at people to get out of the way. This was what drew Elias to places like this. A place where people had to work together to survive, but also a place of community. But that changed as he walked further. As he got deeper, the children disappeared, but there were teenagers, always in groups of 3 or 4. Some of them were selling things. Likely drugs and alcohol, while trying to look dangerous. Horn's directions led Elias to a building made of stones. Some of them had been shaped, but many hadn't. They were instead filled in with a thick, hard plaster. An arch at the front of it was open, and there was a wooden sign swinging over the arch, though the sign was blank. The market wasn't like those in other parts of the city. It was a series of barred windows with locked doors next to them, and small gaps where things could be passed out. Some of them had things hung up behind the bars, so you could look in and see what they were selling. Others had menus or signs. But 1 out of 3 of them would have seemed empty, but for the men who stood behind the window glaring at him. This was the right place. He walked up to a man in the entirely empty shop and said,
I'm looking for Dr. Scott's.
The man grunted something and pointed down one of the arched hallways that led deeper into the building. About 20 feet deeper, the last of the natural light disappeared as the arched tunnel moved past the stone bricks to the tunnels caved into the stone. This still didn't smell right to Elias. The doctor was almost certainly the one who worked with President Horn, so why would she get rid of him at all? More importantly, why would she send someone who might keep him alive? The last thing she would want was a trial. Elias wasn't even sure why he had agreed to arrest the man for her. except that he feared what the message he had sent might do, and felt some small obligation to help. But there was something more. Some connection he was missing, and he was drawn to mystery like a moth to a flame, and in the end, you couldn't find a better place for an ambush if you tried, but if this was a trap, he was already in it. Better to move forward, and hope he was just being paranoid. The door opened to a room, barely wider than the hallway. It had 2 chairs and another door on the other side, this one with a small window. With nothing else to do, Elias knocked on the door. A few seconds later, the window slid open and someone said,
"What you here for?"
Elias hadn't really considered that. But he was fairly certain he knew of at least one thing, so he said,
I'm going to be on lift-in for a bit, and I'd like to stay in contact with my ship. I heard you can give me a communications implant that won't be picked up by the locals.
The window slammed shut, then a few seconds later it slid open again, and a man said,
100 credits up front. Another 100 after it's done.
It seems small to Elias, but his mother had raised 2 kids earning less than that every month. He had just gotten used to people like Vex, who charged thousands of credits for a meeting, that he had forgotten how much normal people spent on things. He put a card in the window. After a few seconds, he heard something behind him. He turned to see 2 large men in pinstripe suits, and behind them was their boss, Ronan Vex. Both were holding guns. In this small room with no cover and 2 well-trained men pointing guns at him, there was no point in trying to escape. He might kill one, but it wouldn't do any good.
I assume there is a reason you haven't already shot me,
Elias said, trying to put together what was happening. He had expected something, but not Vex.
Because I like you,
Ronan said, then added,
and the person who put the bounty out on you is a bit of a moron.
Elias closed his eyes for a moment, realizing what must have happened. Ali had figured out at some point, after the virus wore off, that Elias had the real corporate index. A list of the corporation's greatest secrets that was worth a fortune that would matter, even to someone like Vex. Then she had let it slip to Ronan what Elias had. If so, then she really was a moron because she'd never get it from Vex if he knew what it was. But Elias needed to be careful. Vex hadn't said any of that. He might be fishing.
Promise not to kill me, and I'll take you to it.
Elias answered, careful not to give Ronan any idea what he had.
You'll take me to it without the promise, because you think it will give you the chance to escape,
Ronan said.
I'm keeping my gun,
Elias said, as he pushed past the 2 men. That could have gotten him shot. But either they knew he had the index, making him far too valuable to shoot, or they were going along with the boss. He considered running, as soon as he turned the first corner in the hallway. The stone blocks would give him cover, but he was only a half a dozen steps ahead of the 2 men. Against amateurs, that might be enough. But they would get several clean shots before he made it out of the building, and that would be enough. Once outside, he was shoved into the back seat of Vex's car. He was a bit surprised that Vex sat in the seat next to Elias, with both of the henchmen in front of him.
You seem quite confident that I'm not going to shoot you.
I didn't stay alive this long by being lazy. You've survived too many things to be suicidal, and if you shoot me you'll be dead before that plasma pistol recharges. You'll take your shot before the end. I have no doubt. But this isn't it.
Vex chatted as they drove through town, not seeming to notice as the car forced men, women and children to dive out of the road to avoid being run over. They spoke of the worlds that Elias had visited, and he asked questions about both the Nexari and the life Elias had lived. Elias told him of his family and of a game that no one in the galaxy knew how to play. It was odd. When Vex had been working with Elias, he had done everything he could to intimidate him. But now that he had promised to kill him, he treated him like an old friend. But even that was part of the game. Vex was distracting Elias, so he couldn't plan his escape. As they approached the ghost wake, Elias still hadn't fully worked out the plan, though he knew that Rust was part of it. Elias said,
"I don't suppose you'd let me get it myself."
The gangster grinned. It wasn't a serious request. Once on the ghost wake, Elias would have no reason not to just leave. But it wasn't a pointless request. Elias hoped it might imply that he wanted them to come onto the ship.
Crosby and Caleb will go with you.
Elias looked Vex in the eyes carefully for the first time and said,
"And what will we be getting?"
Vex met his gaze and said,
Something I can use to protect Lifton, far better than any of the local laws could, or you. Don't you agree, Mr. Cade?
Elias nodded, but while it suggested he knew about the index, it didn't confirm it. That could be because he was bluffing, or because he didn't want Crosby and Caleb to know. But either way, this was likely to be the last polite conversation they had, so Elias put out his hand and said,
"You've made this an interesting trip, Ronan. I hope we can work together again."
Vex grinned, something that reminded Elias of a tiger thinking about his prey. The only way that they could work together was if Elias somehow survived. And it seemed unlikely, but he still shook Elias's hand and said,
No grudges or hard feelings, no matter how this goes.
That was a better deal for Elias than Vex. If they killed him, it wouldn't matter, but if he lived, Vex had promised not to punish him for killing the two men. Elias wondered if they knew that. One of the goons moved ahead of him to open the ghost wake. As he did, Elias said to the other,
"I probably wouldn't trust you either."
The man grunted, but didn't say anything. And so Elias said,
"If you were to get it, then you wouldn't need him anymore."
It was a long shot, and wouldn't help him even if it worked, but if they killed him, it might cause a problem for Vex. More importantly, it might distract him because he seemed smart enough to want power. The goon in front entered the code that Elias had given him, then stepped in. Elias hoped Rust had the good sense not to attack the man on his own. He didn't like Rust getting in fights, but if he was going to, Elias needed to be there to help him. After a moment, the thug nodded, and the other jabbed Elias in the back, telling him to move forward. A shame. Elias had hoped they might be stupid enough to both get on before him. It wouldn't be as useful as letting him get on first, but he could still lock them in. He even considered doing it anyway. If he locked the door, he'd only have to deal with one, but they would be ready for that. So Elias went onto the ghost wake. Glancing across the room, he saw the plant. The last living organism from Calthera 6. It had grown enough. Elias hoped he might be able to get seeds from it, or perhaps a cutting. Two plants would be far more likely to survive than one. But that wasn't important now. The plant was where he had hidden the virus that held the corporate index. It was a Tech Level 10 virus. Likely smarter than Elias. But it was still a virus, and seemingly content to live out its life in a plant if that was the best way to survive. He decided not to make this that easy for them, so instead of the plant, he pulled out the box he kept under his hammock. It was old and worn. Far older than it looked, having been packed 100,000 years ago.
Keep the movements slow.
The man who came in here first said, positioning himself close enough that he could menace Elias, but far enough away that Elias couldn't easily attack him. Inside of the box, there was a large wood playboard for the game of Bikron. But he was the only one in the galaxy who knew what Bikron was, and he hoped that the patterns and ancient language might distract them. He picked it up, his hands stretched out on either side, and then glancing at Rust, handed it to the man. The goon tried to take it with one hand so that his other could remain on his gun, but it was too big to do that, and Elias said,
"Your boss won't be happy if you drop it."
It was probably true. The board was worth a small fortune, even if it wasn't what Vex was looking for. And it worked. His first piece of luck as the man holstered his sidearm and took the board with both hands. Elias almost made his move then, but the other man was on edge as he watched, so Elias gave the thug a few seconds to move towards the door with it. At the same time, Rust began to bark. He didn't do that often, and usually quieter, but he had also been genetically altered to be smarter than average dogs and was clearly aware that a distraction would be useful. The thug, whose arms weren't full, said,
"Will you shut up, that animal?"
That was enough. He had barely got the words out before Elias had drawn the talon and fired. He didn't even have time to pull his gun. The other man dropped the priceless artifact at the same time. Rust jumped up and grabbed his gun arm. Rust only held on for a second, but that gave Elias what he needed. The talon took 4 seconds to recharge. Far too long, so Elias grabbed his other weapon. The oath blade he had gotten from the Genic could be as deadly as any gun. The man's suit was, not surprisingly, resistant to cuts, and he wore body armor under it. That wasn't going to make this fight easy, but he slashed at the man's uncovered hand. The thug moved it away, which kept him from losing a finger, but also made drawing the weapon difficult. At the same time, he tried to use his size advantage. With most people that Elias fought, that barely mattered. Often bigger people relied on it too much, and he knew how to fight someone larger than him. The best holds weren't so much about pure strength as they were leverage. But as the much larger man fell into a comfortable fighting stance, Elias recognized he was in trouble. He slashed out twice more as the man reached for the gun. At the same time, Rust barked and danced around his feet. He wasn't likely to do much damage, but if he distracted him, that could turn the fight. Then Elias saw it. The stupidest thing he could do. But it would end the fight, one way or another. So he stopped trying to keep the man's hand away from the gun. The sudden change in tactic was enough. The thug reached for his gun as the curved blade cut across his neck. He was dead as soon as the blade hit. He'd bleed out in seconds, but his body didn't know that yet, so he fired his gun twice. Elias's scout suit was bullet-resistant but not bulletproof, and the gun was big, but the aim was poor. So the 2 shots hit him in the stomach. He'd outlive the thug by an hour or 2 at least, he thought, as the pain pushed him to collapse. But he hadn't survived this long to die when he had options, so he staggered over to the keypad, locking the ghost wake. Then, slipping in the blood of either himself or the other man, or both, he grabbed the edge of the long flat tube-like bed that sat at the side of the room. At least they already know where I am this time, Elias thought as he collapsed into the autodock. A few seconds later, the glass tube closed, and Elias barely had time to say,
Ghostwake, activate autopilot and take me to location 7.
before the anesthesia kicked in. Author's note.
It took a couple of tries to get this week's story to work. I had assumed that the conflict between President Horn and Elias would be more interesting, but it just didn't quite work. I considered skipping the meeting entirely or having him focus on the message getting out, but when I tried, they just didn't work. Then I realized that Elias had made some assumptions that simply didn't need to be true. The most important of those being that Vex and Horn were working against each other, when, in truth, I had made it clear from the beginning that Ronan Vex ran all of the major crime in the city, and that would involve corrupt politicians. And once I decided that they were collaborating, at least a little, everything fell into place. I hope it worked for everyone else. If it did, then you may want to become a patron to get the next story a week early and gain access to a free patron-exclusive story every week, or visit my YouTube channel to get audio versions of the story. Thank you. Elton Gar.